Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This is a bucket list session for me because I'm talking to John Taylor and Peter Boettke, the current and past presidents of the Mont Pelerin Society, classical liberal economists, and we're going to talk about Friedrich Hayek and that first gathering in the 1940s of the Mont Pelerin Society and how far we've come today. Check it out. Okay, this is sort of a bucket list thing for me. We're all gathered here for a regional meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, and today you guys are sort of two of my intellectual gurus when it comes to economics. Two of the most, in my mind, two of the most prestigious economists working in academia today. John Taylor with the Hoover Institute and Stanford University, and Pete Boettke with George Mason University and the Hayek Center. Actually, we'll start with you because I've already butchered your resume. Tell people like who you are.
I was a college buddy of Matt Kibbe.
Yeah, that's the most important thing.
That's the most important thing.
We drank beer together.
We drank beer together. Yeah. No, I'm a professor at George Mason University. I've been there since 1998. So I just finished my 20th year there and got a watch to show it and everything. And I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center.
And you self-identify as an Austrian economist.
I do. I'm the editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. I have, taught graduate classes in Austrian economics. I taught for roughly a decade, a little less than a decade at New York University, along with Israel Kirzner and Mario Rizzo. After I got my PhD, that was really in many ways my first job. And we used to run an annual Austrian economics seminar, and I've devoted a lot of my time and energy to that.
And you're the guy that talked me into switching to economics at Grove City College. And our professor was a guy named Hans Sennholz,
Right.
who was a student of Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, first PhD of Mises in the United States. So, the Mises students, his graduate students were in University of Vienna and then in Geneva and then here at NYU and Sennholz. He had, I think, 4 PhD students during his time at NYU and Sennholz was his first.
Yeah. And interesting to some people watching this, about the time we were studying under Sennholz, he was mentoring this no-name congressman named Ron Paul, who has planted the seeds of Austrian economics in a whole new generation.
Yeah.
And John, you're give us a little bit of your resume.
So I'm a professor at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I teach freshmen, students at Stanford, have been for a long time. And I'm interested in good economics. My teaching is more free market oriented, focuses a lot on economic freedom and the benefits that brings to people across the board. I'm interested in public policy, so I've had several stints in Washington over the years. That's, I think, an important aspect of taking ideas into action.
And you were a Treasury economist for George W. Bush.
Yes.
43.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're famous for, or infamous, depending on whether or not I'm talking to people on one side or the other, but you're famous for something called the Taylor Rule.
That's correct. So I've always been interested in monetary policy since I was an undergraduate, not at Grove City, but at Princeton, a pretty good place. And I actually took a course.
No Grove City, but it's pretty good.
I took a course from a guy named Bob Keeney, and we read Atlas Shrugged, and it was analysis of capitalism. It was a beautiful course. It got me into a lot of these things. But back then, I got interested in monetary policy, and it's all my life, basically. And so one contribution was this so-called Taylor Rule, which was a way to systematize, make more rule-like monetary policy to get away from the discretion, which I think has been harmful. It's very much in the line of people like Milton Friedman, who over the years has argued for a more rule-like policy.
Yeah. So the reason you guys are here is you're the immediate past president of the Mont Pelerin Society, and you're the new president of the Mont Pelerin Society. Is it a 2-year term?
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought we might talk about. I spent the last couple days doing a deep dive on some of the history of the Mont Pelerin Society. There's of course detractors who call it a secret society, but I thought it would be interesting to people to think about where classical liberalism and free market economics was circa 1947 versus where we are today. In some ways, we're leaps and bounds ahead of where we were then, and in other ways, we're dealing with the same arguments. But why don't either one of you? I don't know who wants to go first, but let's talk about the history and what is the Mont Pelerin Society, founded by Friedrich Hayek. Why did he do this?
You're the historian. Why don't you start?
So I think it's important to go back and look at the period of time between in the interwar years. And the rise of various threats to the classical liberal position, or what was just called at the time liberal position that people had. And so I actually think that books that were published in the 1930s by Lionel Robbins and other arguments in the early 40s by Mises and whatnot about the breakdown of the international division of labor, the rise of odious racial doctrines, the threat of communism, the threat of the fascism, all of these kind of things have really challenged the liberal perspective. Obviously, the Great Depression is a major factor in affecting where liberals stand, and so they needed to have a rebirth of liberalism. They had a meeting in France around Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society, which argued that against these trends that were going. That's what Lippmann's book does, and so they gathered together a group of liberal economists and historians and social thinkers in general, and they were supposed to continue that, but then the war broke out.
Yeah.
And so then after the war, Hayek wanted to reinvigorate that conversation in order to hopefully breathe life back into liberalism for a new era. So it wasn't trying to recapture something old. It was trying to continually renew something for today's challenges in the immediate area of in this case of the war, and that included things like how was Europe going to be reconstructed, and the European project as was understood, which eventually later on led to the Treaty of Rome and other things. And so, yeah, that's there was a low time for liberal thought and economics because of the Great Depression and these other things. And so now how do you come out of that? What do we learn from that? And to sort of fix the science as well as the broader policy or practical implications of things.
Let's define liberalism so that people understand what we're talking about, because the words are all confused today.
So I think, so when Hayek and Mises and whatnot think about liberalism, or Frank Knight, who were the major sort of thinkers at the time, when they think about liberalism, they do not mean progressive liberalism as has been understood. They mean a private property economy, one that respects freedom of contract, and also has a constitutionally limited government constructed, that has monetary policy that is sound, fiscal policy that's responsible, open in international trade. These are the kind of doctrines that they thought drove the tremendous growth in the 19th century, and they believed that it could be the guiding rule for actions in the 20th century. Yeah.
So broadly speaking, that framework today, we could call it classically liberal. We could call it constitutional conservatism.
Yeah.
We could call it libertarian, but that's basically anymore when you say the word liberal, it's sort of a fighting word that people misinterpret. But part of the context here, certainly for Hayek and Mises and maybe some of the other economists that were founders of Mont Pelerin, was Mises and Hayek in particular had to flee Nazi Germany and the invasion of Austria. So this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is a question of life or death, and the broader the broader ability of people to be free, really sandwiched between Soviet socialism and Nazi Germany.
I think that's right. I think when Hayek first invited the people, 37 came, but a little more than that were invited. It was December 1946, and he had the idea. He had just been working on this, giving talks about it, and had the idea of bringing like-minded people together from mainly Europe and the United States. And they came and they met in this town in Switzerland. In fact, they debated what to call it. They all sorts of names. Hayek wanted to be named after Tocqueville or Lord Acton, and some didn't want names. They wanted ideas. And so right at the end, someone said, why don't we just call it where we're meeting, Mont Pelerin? And that stuck, and it's still called Mont Pelerin. But it was quite remarkable. They came together. You can see the things I discussed. They're not too much different than what we're discussing at this meeting. Things don't change. And the challenges then were socialism and communism and totalitarianism and things that really hurt people. And they were interested in finding ways to make lives better for people. And they focused on this in a very successful way. I think it's quite remarkable that they were able to, they had funding to get the people from various parts of the world. It's still difficult to travel, not like today. So
let's name drop some of these people. We've already talked about Hayek and Mises, but a very young guy named Milton Friedman was there.
I would emphasize Milton quite a bit. He came, Aaron Director came, and a guy named from Stanford, Carl Brandt came. He's later a member of...
Nice plug for Stanford there.
Yeah. Later a member of Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors.
Yeah.
And so they talked it up a lot. Actually, later, Friedman became president of Mont Pelerin Society and was very active. He spent the 1980 having a meeting of that society at Stanford at Hoover Institution. So that was very much part of it. I think, in fact, there's really questions about the influence of the Mont Pelerin Society over the years. People are asking, what difference did it make? And, there really weren't publications. It wasn't emphasized on public policy directly, but I think indirectly it had huge impacts. Just as an example, this is later on, 1980, but 22 of the advisors of Reagan were from Mont Pelerin Society. And I think to me, it was, the words are confusing, liberalism, and it means different things to different people, but I like to stress economic freedom, and that's rule of law, predictable policy, emphasis on markets, don't forget incentives, and a limited role for government, and we focus on those, and that's been a common theme throughout. Especially if we forget, and I think it was too bad we forgot. We're not forgetting as much anymore. Is that the rule of law was always so important. It was a way to preserve freedom. It was a way to guarantee freedom, and a lot of economists forgot that. Markets, of course, are important, but that rule of law, and when the Soviet Union fell. And looks like capitalism coming back, we forgot about the rule of law, and it was maybe the most important thing that Hayek wrote about at the time.
Yeah. Well, let's actually.
I can say something about that. It's one of my favorite stories about Milton Friedman. By the way, early on also was George Stigler and Lionel Robbins, as well as Frank Knight. So the people there at that first meeting were some of the best minds that economics had to offer in the 20th century, and so they all were debating these kind of positions. But Friedman went to China in 1979, and he said a famous dictum, which they said, Professor Friedman, what would you do to fix our economy? And he said, privatize, privatize, privatize. And about 6 months before he passed away, he was doing a radio interview with Russ Roberts, and Russ asked him if there was anything he would change. And he said, oh yeah, privatize, 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 provided there's a rule of law.
Yeah.
And that changes the entire issue. And so this issue, as John was just saying, on the essential framework and the importance of those institutional framework within which the free economy and a free society operates, that's always been a theme that the people that were brought to Mont Pelerin wanted to stress and discuss and debate about how is the best arguments for understanding that essential institutional framework.
Yeah, and by rule of law, we're talking about the institutions, both formal and informal, that really puts the emphasis on people making choices as opposed to the rule of man. I think a lot of people misunderstand when we say rule of law today. It almost sounds kind of authoritarian, right? It's the man telling you what to do, but it's the opposite of that. And of course, this again gets back to that life or death situation they're in, where the rule of law had been replaced by a charismatic authoritarian like Hitler or like Stalin, very, very brutal dictators. And I think one of the things that we struggle with today is just getting people to appreciate those institutional constraints that allow people to prosper.
Yeah, it's a major issue of why it is that we have to talk about things like John was talking about in monetary policy, rules versus discretion, or in law and economics. If you think about a lot of the developments in economics that took place in the period after Mont Pelerin was formed, they rediscover a lot of core ideas of classical economics using modern economic tools. That includes law and economics, the application of economic reasoning to political decision-making, new institutional economics, property rights economics in general. And if you follow, you can see a lot of the people that were major innovators of those ideas, Ronald Coates and Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, they also were members of the Mont Pelerin Society. And that conversation was encouraged, and if you look back and look at the Constitution of Liberty, which Hayek published in 1960, but is based on a lot of the lectures that he gave throughout the 1950s, that is about trying to get us to think about this institutional infrastructure.
By the way, this sort of slips by, but I would point out that each of you previously, were sitting in the same freaking chair as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. No pressure at all there, right?
Well, it is pretty amazing, and people actually frequently are contrasting them, but they're so much alike, I think, in the issues we're discussing. I have the 1980 meeting on my mind because it's coming up on 40 years, and it was a session where Hayek and Friedman were together on ways to constrain the growth of government, and they had different perspectives. It was just at the time that Friedman had put out this video programs called Free to Choose. It was part of a book. And then that was also an important time, I think, in the history where these ideas were spreading.
Right.
I mean, the United States, Great Britain, and China. Deng Xiaoping was bringing in a lot of the ideas at that point. So it was, in a way, a victory. And I think people at the time were seeing it was a really accomplishment of this society and the people who belong to it. I think now it's sort of a little bit of repetition. We're going back, and it just shows you that you can't ever be complacent. You have to keep working. You have to keep fighting, because there's always pressures. There's always obstacles, and they change over time, but they're always going to be there. I think it's progress. In the meantime, there's incredible progress. All these people coming out of poverty around the world, and I think you can trace that to basic free market principles. But still, it could go back. It could slide back, and got to keep working at it.
I was, I got into economics. I started at college in the late 1970s, and so my study of economics was reinforced by Friedman's Free to Choose videos coming out, but also his performances on things like the Donahue Show and everything like that. He was a unique intellectual. I mean, he just is very talented in his ability to communicate with people that didn't agree with him. And I think that is one of the things that is just, I think people today should see a character like that's able to talk across various discourse communities and be able to do it. He could talk to his peers in economics and be unrivaled in many ways, and yet he could talk on the Phil Donahue Show, which was the equivalent of Oprah, which doesn't even exist anymore. So whatever the most popular daytime TV show is, and be amazing on it. And it was something when you were studying economics and you'd see Milton Friedman be able to communicate ideas in the most basic way to people and yet communicate the core idea. It really was encouraging and inspiring. Yeah.
It's kind of, I hadn't really thought about it until you said that, but he's the first guy to really sort of leverage new technology to reach the masses, because, Hayek, of course, wrote The Road to Serfdom, which was a pop culture book, right? Even though it's a pretty substantial book. and Friedman used TV. But today, the equivalent would be there's a podcaster named Joe Rogan who reaches zillions of people, and they have 3-hour conversations about substantial subjects. And if people haven't done it, by the way, you should pull down some of these old Friedman appearances on Donahue on YouTube. They're just amazing.
I recommend. I show it to my students. He does a terrific job. In fact, he always wanted to respond to people. He said, if someone takes the time to write me a letter, I'm going to write him back. That was his attitude.
Yeah.
And he got so many letters and comments from the Free to Choose series that he had to just do a form letter because he couldn't respond to thousands of people. But he was so considerate about individuals. Yeah. And that's why I think it was so. I don't think anyone ever won an argument with Milton. My wife likes to say she did, but it's quite remarkable. Very kind. One time we did a video together in a studio in San Francisco, and he was already in his 90s. And we walked into the studio. It was a little riser you had to walk up, and it was very dark. And he tripped over the riser. It was horrifying. Glasses went flying, and no one knew what to do. But he got up. He had not one unkind word to say to anybody. He said, "Let's go do the video." It was just inspiring in many respects.
Yeah, he really is special. I mean, it's and I think that going back to the way he used media, the other alternative show that you would have watched at the time that you would have gotten the substantive content of a more market-oriented position would have been Firing Line with Bill Buckley. But I was a kid from New Jersey, and I didn't come from academic kind of background or anything like that. So to me, Buckley was an elitist. And the way I would view him is he was an elitist, and that his, most of the time his guests that were on there were elitist.
Yeah.
But Milton Friedman never appeared to be an elitist. He, in fact, appeared to be with the people, and that the concern was helping. One of the things I think was really powerful about Friedman was he always made the audience feel that he cared about the same things that they care about, but he disagreed with them about the way to achieve their goals. And I do think that's the way we reason as economists, is that we treat ends as given and reason about the effectiveness of means to those given ends. And that Friedman was a master at doing that. And it really was.
He also led with emotion. We were talking about this in the car this morning. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says it's better to be morally right than factually correct. And we would obviously dispute that. We think the facts matter. But I think what she's really saying is that making that values-based, I'm trying to solve a problem that you care about. And you think about those old Friedman versus Donahue things. Donahue looked like the elitist, and Friedman's engaging the audience. And he always led with, let me tell you how we can solve this problem together. And that's something that I think economists generally sort of suck at. Like we're so focused on the laws of economics, we forget to sort of establish we care about the fact that we're lifting people out of poverty or not. We care about the fact that people in Venezuela are starving.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so true. And you need to keep reminding people of that. Again, the fact that 1 billion people out of poverty in 15 years is just incredible. And that's because of markets. I mean, you look around the world, you see the disaster cases. It's Venezuela. It's just, it's so clear. And I think the more you can say what the facts are, the facts do matter. Right? Some things are successful. Hayek emphasized the facts when he said socialism wasn't working. Don't go that way.
Yeah.
And Friedman certainly. And actually, I would say one other thing, besides the moral aspects and the facts, you have to find a way to make this happen. And I think just one word about Milton Friedman again, he's a great theorist. And he wrote this Capitalism and Freedom in 1960. Which was more academic than Time to Choose, but it had great influence too. There he was looking at specific suggestions. And I know in many cases, I talked to him, remember calling him when I was working in Washington, asking for advice. He'd always have suggestions that seemed in the weeds to most people. They weren't just general kinds of things. So I think it just says to make the world better, to apply these ideas of economic freedom, classical liberalism, you have to find a way to make it happen. So it's both those together. I think Friedman really did both of those quite well.
I was at the Fed birthday celebration in Dallas Fed, to honor Milton Friedman, and that's actually somewhat of a kind of famous meeting because that's where Bernanke said the thing that to Milton that we will never repeat the error that you identified in the monetary history book, and but also Gary Becker gave the lunch talk. And one of the things that was really fascinating about Becker, he talked about the influence of Friedman, and it relates to just what John was talking about. Becker was a pretty talented guy. He was an undergraduate at Princeton. He already had a paper, I think, in the QJE or AER, one of the top 5 journals. And then he said he came to Chicago and he had to relearn economics. And Friedman was his mentor. And he said what he learned from Friedman was that, one, that economics is not just a clever game to be played by professionals, which is one of the, vices that we fall into. But he says it's not that. But then the second one was that economics is about the world, about the real world, not about just on the blackboard. So we work on the blackboard, but it's always to help us to understand what's going on outside in the world. And, Becker said it much better than I just said it, but it was really kind of inspiring as a teacher of economics to try to communicate that kind of idea to your students about that this isn't just a clever, you're not just having a game for clever people, and then it's also really matters, what we're saying.
So I want to go back and I want to unpack 2 seemingly contradictory statements. The first is we've come a long way since the dark days where 30-something classical liberals had to hide at a mountaintop on Mont Pelerin because they were surrounded by authoritarianism and just all sorts of bad deadlyisms, as I call them, versus we're having the same freaking argument today as we sit down that Hayek and his colleagues were trying to deal with in the late 1930s. But one thing you said I think is kind of interesting. They debated about what to call this thing, but it was really important to them that they didn't choose sides. They didn't want to be affiliated with one wing of the political spectrum of the other.
Yes.
They didn't want to be affiliated with political parties. They didn't actually even want to be affiliated with a specific thinker, so they just named it after the mountain.
Right.
And that's important because we're striving to be objective thinkers and problem solvers as opposed to apparatchiks. We're not flacking for somebody.
I think that's true. In fact, well, we're on the same side in many respects. We have debates, right?
Yeah.
Like monetary policy is a debate. How to operate a welfare system is a debate. How to guarantee how the rule of law and all that is always a debate. So that's very much part of it. But I think you also have to remember that you have to keep doing it because people forget. And when I was teaching economics when the Soviet Union existed, and you could point to the crazy system, build one big nail instead of a lot of little nails, and it was useless. But that's no longer there, and so students don't remember that, and so they have to think of other things. And I think that's what you're seeing now. There's no obvious thing to point. I mean, you point to Venezuela, but that's different. So that's different. That's not. So you have to be still doing this and showing what works and what doesn't. But I think it's harder when you don't have history in people's minds. You have to tell them. I like to bring Adam Smith to my course. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I have a recording of someone sounds like Adam Smith, and at least the guy existed. So so even if you don't read the books,
so it's not a sense of it. It's not a book; it's a person.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's trying to solve problems.
Exactly.
I love that. But like geographically, and sort of figuratively, Switzerland was sandwiched between fascism on one side, Spain, Portugal, obviously Hitler before that, and communism or war communism or however you want to characterize Stalin,
right?
Just a guy that killed a lot of people on the other side. And, as a metaphor, they were sandwiched between these two false choices, fascism, authoritarianism versus socialist authoritarianism. And today it seems like we're doing the same thing. We have the rise of right-wing nationalism, and so-called democratic socialism. And when you try to point out to people, I mean, from my point of view, these are variations of the same theme, because yes, socialism technically is actual government control of the means of production, but at the margin, in Venezuela, it's a combination of just thug authoritarianism that's telling producers what to do and actual nationalization of industries. That toxic combination is what's created the poverty and things there. So in one way, we're so much better off than we were when these guys had to hide at the mountaintop. But I feel like here we are. And as you said, it's a process that never ends.
There's ups and downs. You want to make, but there's going to be setbacks, and you got to keep going. That's how I view it. And I think sandwich is a good analogy. I think another important aspect of Mont Pelerin is they wanted to have Germany become a market economy again.
Right.
Ludwig Erhard was very much part of this. And at that time, some people just want to squish it.
Yeah.
Constrain it. And that philosophy was so important. And so it was a revival of Germany after the war, and it just made so much difference. I think that's sort of maybe a forgotten part of.
I mean, that's why Walter Euchen's involvement in the early meetings was so important, and that was one of the big things that they wanted to look for, was the way that the Allied countries, people from the Allied countries, would interact with the German intellectuals as they came, and so it was kind of that's a big part. I wanted to address your issue by again invoking another Friedman statement, which I think is full of wisdom, which he argues that in the period between 1960 and 1980, and then the post-1980 era. So again, Milton made this distinction a lot between the way that his reaction was to capitalism and freedom, and then the reaction to free to choose. Because there's a huge reaction to the way the world happened when that book was published and when this book was published. And he said it's because during that intervening period, we won the battle of ideas. But he said in the post-1980 period, we lost the battle of implementation. And that reinforces. So one of the things that's really interesting about Free to Choose is that he actually has the public choice sort of stories kind of in it, whereas in the Capitalism and Freedom, he doesn't have that as much emphasized, but he does in Free to Choose, including the constitutional analysis, but also the sort of interest group politics. And that later on becomes like his book where he refers to the iron triangle, right? The tyranny of the status quo, which is how difficult it is to break these various different alliances that you form. And I think that's become one of the really important lessons that we've learned, is that we can't become triumphalists over, say, the collapse of communism, which was an amazing moment in history, and it freed up millions of people that had been living under oppression. But yet at the same time, then the work really gets going on how do you get these institutions in place. And so that, it's interesting, back at Grove City, just very quickly about the nature of history. When we were at Grove City, we had to take a course, I don't know if you remember, is on basically the history of like Western civilization kind of thing. And the guy who I had for it was a strange teacher. I don't know who you had, but I had a guy named Kaufman. And he made us read this book called The Canticle for Leibowitz. Which is a science fiction book. So, and what happens in the Canticle of Leibowitz is that you have a nuclear annihilation, and then civilization has to rediscover itself. And the sub-theme in it is the different notions of time. So is it like the Greeks where you're just, continually cycling, or is it like an Enlightenment idea where you're in darkness and you just march to truth? And the way I've always read that book is that it's like a corkscrew.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you make progress, but you also can cycle back and you repeat a lot of the same things. Then you make some, like this. And so that's why, to me, I've always been fascinated by this idea of why it is that we're deja vu all over again on some of these debates. So like right now, we're debating issues over monopoly. We're debating issues over monetary policy, fiscal policy that in fact have been debated for before, but now they're in a new context. And so rather than say the rise of the modern corporation, we're now dealing with monopoly and platform economies, right? And so what about those arguments that we developed to meet the challenge of the modern corporation? How much of those still apply to now the platform economies and whatnot? And so I think, it does take varied iterations to force alien concepts upon reluctant minds. But at the same time, we have to continually recognize that we have to think hard about the context within which we're making these arguments.
Yeah, and it's a very it's a fundamentally Austrian insight that human knowledge and the process by which we figure stuff out is in real time, and it never ends. And the institutions that hold us together as a civil society weren't just airdropped in at the beginning of the process. We did that in this process. So if you leave the battlefield of ideas, you're allowing someone else to redefine what those institutional structures should and could be.
I think Pete refers to this sort of cycle, corkscrew, whatever, but to some extent it's because people see there's some problems. Like in the U.S., we saw these problems in the 70s, higher inflation, higher unemployment, and it seemed like a mess, and it was changed. In the 80s and 90s were better, and then it went back. So, but people get complacent after it's going okay for a while, and they don't make the changes. But then again, referring to what Pete just said, there is some changes in understanding. So I take regulation. There was, and George Stickle had a lot to do with this. There was this sense in which there was regulatory capture, and the regulated industries were benefiting from the regulation. So you had to break that.
Yeah.
The railroads on, and that was an insight that actually helped improve the policy. You can't just say as regulation's bad. You have to, it's there because of this relationship, and that made all the difference.
And by the way, the concept of regulatory capture, the idea that inevitably industry will get a seat at the table with government first and sort of game the rules against the people, customers, and also upstart. That should be a conversation that we can have with people that support bigger government, because one of the fundamental problems they have, of course, is that the little guy doesn't get a seat at the table. The little guy will never get a seat at the table. Jeff Bezos, he's always going to have a seat at the table. Yeah. And I had this argument with one of my progressive friends, and they have to deal with this question of concentrated power, because if you're worried about concentrated business interests, you also need to be worried about concentrated government interests. And I think that's a conversation we can have with people that are flirting with democratic socialism, because I don't think they think about that phrase. Whatever we think the word socialism means, I think young people have a very different interpretation of what that is.
So, the video clip of AOC holding her first hearing, which was on campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
If you would take her out of that picture, you could have put Gordon Tullock in there and have the same conversation about the interest groups that were forming and everything like that. And so I think that we should be talking to people about those kind of ideas. What George Stigler and Sam Peltzman did to understand the regulatory economy and the existence of regulatory capture, just really can't be forgotten. Just a funny story on that. I was at a conference at the LSE many years ago, and Ann Kruger was there. She's a wonderful development economist, and she said, "No offense to my George Mason friends." There was only me, so no offense to my George Mason friends, but what we really want is reasonable regulation that's not capturable by interests. And I laughed because I raised my hand and they said, "What, Pete?" And I said, "What if that's a null set?" Yeah. and then someone said, "Why are you so unreasonable?" But that is the question. I think that when we think about all of these kind of institutions, we should be thinking about building the robust set of institutions. We have to remember that part of what Hayek and what Friedman also were arguing was an old Adam Smith line, which is that what liberalism, or whatever we want to call it, tried to find a set of rules where bad men, if they were given power, could do least harm, rather than finding a system where the best and the brightest could be in control and unshackled. That's the whole point about the limited government idea, is that you want to make sure that even if someone gets in for reasons that we don't like, that they're constrained so much in their exercising of power that they can't do as much harm as they otherwise would have done.
The rule of law versus the rule of man.
Yeah.
Yeah, Keynes wrote to Hayek saying, don't worry, you just have good people in charge.
Yeah.
And Friedman wrote about that letter that Keynes wrote to Hayek. So that's a long debate, still going on. Just to point to good people, we all set, rather than thinking about the constraints that are so important. And
someday we'll find that guy that we can trust with all that power, just maybe. But it's an interesting conversation to have. And I was thinking about this in the context. I just reread Hayek's essay, "The Intellectuals and Socialism," and I was thinking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as I'm reading that. And I think critics of socialism should reread that, because one of the things he says that is so profoundly important, and this may not be true for Joseph Stalin, but it is certainly true for an 18-year-old young woman who thinks that Bernie Sanders is cool.
Right.
And he says we need to take the advocates of socialism both seriously, and we need to assume that their intentions are good. That they care about people, that they're trying to solve problems, and that the error that they're making is one of economics, and he doesn't say it this way, but economics and facts.
Yeah.
And we don't do that now. Like socialism, you know, on our side, we use it as a pejorative. Like, that's socialism, and we talk about Venezuela, and every time I do a video on Venezuela, and I try to explain to people, the response on social media is, that's not socialism, that's oligarchy. That's not socialism, that's state capitalism. There's all these categories about why it went wrong. A lot of people blame, U.S. foreign policy for this. They have all sorts of excuses for that. But the one thing we need to do is to take someone like AOC seriously, and think about the values he's trying to pursue. Do you guys agree with that, or thinking about where we are today, what do we do about this trend in democratic socialism?
I would say first, seems that the goal is to bring people out of poverty, right?
Yeah.
To make, in terms of economics at least, to that's really help people improve their lives, and that's the goal. And I think what we've observed, is the way to do that is economic freedom, and that makes all the difference. And that's why China is so much different after Deng Xiaoping than before with Mao. And you can go country after country. That's why the U.S. has been successful in certain periods and less than others, but successful all around. And now I think this maybe be stressed more, because there is a question of income distribution. It is a question. So I live in California, rich state, highest poverty rate in the country, highest poverty. We should care about that. We should do something.
That's a shocking
Don't let that alone.
Yeah.
Let's get at that. And I think economic freedom economic freedom for all will help that greatly, and has to do with education and things. So I agree completely with that.
Yeah, I just to follow along on that. I think it's really important to understand Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. His dedication is to socialists of all parties. Yeah, and that was not meant as a snarky comment. That wasn't like, oh, ha, ha, like that.
He was actually seeing the future, by the way.
But he was being very sincere, because his colleagues at London all believed that they had to be socialists in their economics because they were liberals in their politics, and that the issues of the Great Depression and the rise of monopoly power had so threatened the ability to have a working democracy that they had to fix the one to get the other. And what Hayek is trying to show them is that this is a tragic loss, because you will end up by advocating policies which will end up by being your own worst nightmare. That's why it's called The Road to Serfdom. It's a tragedy. It's a tragic story rather than a kind of a snarky, criticism. I think it became a caricature because, there was a cartoon book and things like that. But the reality is that the book is a very sincere effort to talk to people that are opposite of him, to share their goals, but to show that the means that they're pursuing to achieve those goals are not going to actually realize those outcomes. And so that leads to the road to serfdom, and then that leads to what you were talking about before in the follow-up to that. So yeah.
Let's remind people of a data point that you mentioned. Like, correct me, you guys will know this better than me, but let's say in the last 20, 30 years, 70% of the world population has been lifted out of poverty. Did I butcher that? This is according to the World Bank, not.
According to the World Bank figures, yeah, the globalization has been extremely good for the poor in the world. It's also the case that while rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten richer faster than the rich have gotten richer in that. There is in-country, obviously, discrepancies. And as John said, these are things that we really have to care about and pay attention to. There's a kind of what has been tracked by some of the best work by like Raj Chetty and others is that there's a slowing of the mobility between the income quintiles in the United States. And so what's going on with that and exploring that, there's tremendous questions to ask, but it's not the case that globalization has rendered the least advantaged among us worse off. It actually has been the vehicle by which the least advantaged have been lifted out of poverty.
Which kind of gets to the second point that stuck with me in Hayek's essay, because he worries, and I think we should all worry about this. He worries that those of us that believe in markets sound like we're defenders of the status quo, that we're defenders of the established order, and the socialists always sound like we can do better. They have a very, and I think he uses the word utopian. They have this utopian vision about doing better than we are today. And it's important to put where we are today in the context of some of the really bad mistakes that have been made in the past. But I suspect young people, particularly in the United States, have no conception of what it means to stand in line for gasoline in the 1970s, let alone stand in line at a grocery store hoping that you can feed your children like mothers in Venezuela do today. That's not their historical context. They're dealing with a different set of problems. So I think, I walked away from reading that essay thinking of AOC's recent quote where she says it's more important to be morally correct than factually right. Or I screwed that up. It's more important to be morally right than factually correct. And she, basically what she's saying is I'm leading with a moral vision of this utopian idea that we can do better. We should do that because we have both, right? We have this vision of how to lift people out of poverty. We have this vision of a very small d democratic world where power is dispersed and where people can pursue their own dreams. But we always sound like we're arguing about marginal tax rates or free trade agreements and stuff like that. And how do we make our idea?
So I think your views have to be grounded in facts. Otherwise, it's just philosophy, and you say anything.
Right.
You could say completely wrong things, historically inaccurate, and that's a danger, by the way. So I agree with you, but I think the facts have to be there. One of the essays that I like to remind people of Hayek is this notion that prices aren't set by some external. They come out of the system. Yeah. Use of knowledge in society. It's just, and to convey that to students is really important. We do experiments and people buy and sell and they can see the prices being formed. And it's, you can't decide on the price. It's going to be the wrong price for sure. And a lot of times government does get involved in price setting. It usually doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
So I think the more that you have simple stories, because in a way the socialism story is simple. We'll just do the right thing. It'll be better for you. Don't worry. Mm-hmm. And the decentralization, automatically, how is decentralization going to work? You have to explain that to people. It works better, and not only in theory but in practice.
The setting of prices and is a radically democratic process in that sense. Everybody's voting all the time.
Yes.
And so I hate the fact that we're abandoning the word democracy, so I'm trying to rehabilitate this word to mean what I think it means, which is power in the hands of individuals making choices.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons why I resist giving up on the word liberal as well, is because those things are tied together.
Yeah.
The idea that we're one another's equals when it comes to the polity and the way that we interact with one another. Democracy is a way of relating to one another in society. And so that is very much a part of this project. You know, Adam Smith has a wonderful line, which is that the only difference between the street porter and the philosopher is in the mind of the philosopher. And Smith spends a tremendous amount of time in going through in that book, and also in the theory of moral sentiments, basically pulling on the nostril hairs of anyone who's arrogant enough to think that they can rule over others.
Yeah.
And so what the Smith vision is a one in which we govern with each other rather than that we govern over somebody. And part of the problem with other things is when we have the idea that we can govern over rather than govern with. And I think that's really what we need to be communicating in a political theory sense with the young people, and that the role that economics plays in that, because economics, free economy is a very vital part of enabling the ability to govern with. And a controlled economy is the method for governing over. And so there's going to be this clash between those.
That sounds like both a research paradigm and a communication strategy for getting people to understand how this thing we call markets actually function.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, we're all trying our best. I mean, John, you know, talking about teaching principles of economics, you know, we're both economists, and we care about economics, and we want to teach sound economics, and that's what we care about, good economics. But our Mont Pelerin Society, we're very much interested in expanding and communicating that conversation with historians, with political theorists, you know, with political scientists, with, you know, all across all the disciplines, as well as people that are, as John put it, dedicated to bringing ideas into action in various different ways, including maybe not so much ideas into action exclusively in politics, but maybe ideas into action in community-based ideas, right? Which matters in the way that you develop civil society and you work with communities and rebuild that. And I think this is, you know, where a lot of the action is going to have to be at, intellectually and in thinking and in doing, is in reinvigorating communities. Yeah.
Yeah, it's real social change comes upstream of politics, from the bottom up.
Yeah.
With based on the, you know, the ideas that people have and the way that they process the world around them based on that framework.
Yeah, I mean, that might explain the Friedman point about the winning the battle of ideas but not winning the battle of implementation.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, you have to have a variety of pillars in place, right? You have to have the social and cultural attitudes for sort of, you know, reinforcing the political and legal environment and the unleashing of the economic environment.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. You know, you wrote a book once where you said, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And I think that is fundamental. I saw Bob Higgs, who's a hero of mine, recently sum up his position in response to people agitating against him. And he said, how about it? Have you ever thought of the idea if we just get out of people's ways and off of their backs, that they might be able to do wonderful and miraculous things? And I agree with that, but I think that we have to actually study that and communicate that even more to empower that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wish we'd talk more about is federalism.
Yeah.
And the decisions made at local levels. It's actually part of freedom.
Yeah.
That's an important aspect. The United States has emphasized that from its start. And it does provide more freedom. Also, people at the ground level, they know much more than the people at the top somewhere. It was little, you know, local school districts. Anyone who's been involved in local politics really recognizes that there's so much information that comes at these lower, so-called lower levels where it's really affecting people's lives. So we probably should be working more on that. I think the technology could help quite a bit. I really like the podcasts and the things you're referring to again, but I think there's much more that could happen. I mean, just think about the ability of a poor farmer in Africa to learn how to rotate crops through the internet.
Yeah.
And to do communications of simple financial transactions. It's huge. And I hope that the concerns about privacy, which are very real, they don't get in the way of this incredible ability to spread the word, and partly is spread the word of what really works.
I read a really cool book not that long ago. It's called Big City, No Lights. and it's about in Africa, they didn't have the electric grid at all, so these cell phones gave so much freedom to people, but how do you have them if you don't have electricity? You end up they become a paperweight, right? And so what use are they? So what happened, this guy, Whit Alexander, started a mobile recharging center and then rechargeable batteries for the cell phones. And it's called Burrow. It's a non-profit, I think, that, we could donate money to or whatever. And they set up these and then the little kiosks with the rechargeable batteries are set up as a market around in Africa, and you're able to recharge your cell phone. But then once just having a cell phone gives so much power to being able to do things like set up a business and do all kinds of other areas which enable, sort of all these wealth creating opportunities. And so I think just little things like that and studying and understanding where that comes from, because that doesn't come from some government dictate. It comes from empowering the creativity of individuals. Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap this up because you have to get back and gavel in the Mont Pelerin Society. What are some of the hot topics that we're going to deal with this week?
Actually, the theme is debates about classical liberalism. And so all the things that we seem like we agree on, we're going to be debating the fundamentals. I think it's, in a way, that's the nature of this society in the beginning. You can usually improve things by debating them.
Yeah.
And there's different views that got to get sorted out. So I think it's a good theme. That's what we're going to be focusing on, and hopefully come out of that with a better ability to affect the world and people that we talked about.
Conversations, arguments, and a little bit of open-mindedness.
Right.
That's the ethos at Mont Pelerin.
Right.
Yeah.
Love it. Thank you, guys. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Very cool.
Okay, great.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.